Henry N. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington presents World Focus, a continuing series on international political, social, economic, and cultural issues.
Welcome to the Jewish Studies program. I'm Esther Helfgott, and my guest today is Gail Simon, a lesbian feminist activist. Gail is a member of Seattle's Kadima, a chapter of New Jewish Agenda. She is a member of Kadima's Feminist Task Force, and on the national level, she is a representative to the New Jewish Agenda's Feminist Task Force. She is involved in a number of organizational activities concerned with social change, and she is here today to talk to us about Jewish lesbian feminism. Welcome, Gail.
Hi.
Gail, how do you connect your lesbianism and your Jewishness? How do they come together in your life or not come together?
Well, my lesbianism and my Jewishness came together after my lesbianism came together with the rest of me. I grew up in New York, and my Jewishness was pretty much taken for granted. And then as I became more involved in world affairs and moved to Seattle 3 years ago, my Jewishness, lesbianism, feminism all kind of moved together in different ways. And they're kind of inseparable now. Just as someone who's involved in social change and in lives of women and lives of people in general, it's very hard to separate it all.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've said to me at one point or another that lesbianism and Jewishness come together because of similar kinds of oppression. What do you mean by that?
Well, as a Jewish lesbian, I have the oppression of women, of a lesbian and a Jew, and Jews have been oppressed over the years, and lesbians have been oppressed as well, though in different ways. I mean, lesbians have not been out very much as lesbians because it's not been acceptable to be gay. And understanding what it's like to be anything from laughed at and ignored to hated and have your life threatened. I haven't personally had my life threatened, but that's the experience of many gay people, many lesbians. And knowing what it's like to not be able to be who I am in family situations, to not be honest about what's very important to me, has given me more of an understanding of why it's so important to be out as a Jew as well.
Mm-hmm. What does that mean, out as a Jew? You weren't always out as a Jew?
Well, I was a Jew. I never had to make a point of it like I had once I moved to Seattle.
And that was 3 years ago?
Meeting people who never met a Jew before was just phenomenal to me.
What was that like?
I knew it was going to happen, but I had never met anyone who never knew a Jew. Or maybe in the East Coast, people just were a little more sophisticated and wouldn't say it. Mm-hmm. I was in the bank in the university district, and someone asked me what my star was. And I told her, and she said, "Oh, does that mean you're Jewish?" And she had no idea what it meant, and she was very fascinated. And I just thought that I just didn't expect such ignorance, really.
Mm-hmm. So you felt you had to come to terms with your Jewish identity in the Pacific Northwest in a way that you didn't have to in New York?
Mm-hmm. That's one way to say it.
Mm-hmm. And what about lesbianism? Did you come out in New York or Seattle?
I came out in 1977 in New York, and I was working in a women's center at Brooklyn College. So I came out with a lot of feminist thought, a lot of active lesbian feminist thought, though only 4 out of maybe 40 women at the women's center were lesbians.
You were 17?
No.
How?
No, I'm 34, so I was 23. Oh. 22, actually. Mm-hmm. It was January. But it was a process. It wasn't one day I woke up and decided I was a lesbian. It was a process that started a long time ago, and was able to develop and blossom when I was around women who were working on issues that were important to us, when we were able to work well in new ways, where we all took leadership responsibility, and where lesbians were positive things. You know, the idea of lesbianism was a positive image. And it all came together over the years I worked there, and has been developing and growing and changing ever since.
And how did your family deal with this? How did you talk to your family about your lesbianism?
Well, I was living out. I wasn't living home anymore at the time, but I was real close to my parents. And they were confused by it and thought it was a phase, as many people do. And now they accept it because they accept me, you know, and it's part of it. Actually, they have less trouble with me being a lesbian than they do with understanding how involved I am and how public I am about my politics, and that's very different to them.
Did you come from an observant home?
Yeah, I came from
An Orthodox home?
An Orthodox home, but there's never any reasons why we did anything. We happened to, what I say is we happened to fall into the Orthodox tradition, and we just did it that way. But there was never any discussion of what it meant. Everything was in Hebrew. I knew nothing of what I was saying. And I think what became important to me was the traditions and the symbols, lighting candles on Friday night, holiday celebrations, even going to shul, though I didn't understand what was going on, and there wasn't a lot of room in my home for questioning. There wasn't a lot of room for questioning about lots of things. It wasn't a place where there was a lot of talk about social change. I didn't learn about the world from my home.
And you weren't educated Jewishly, obviously.
No,
you
my
weren't
brother
Westminster.
was.
Your brother was.
Yeah, that was
How
the
does that make?
tradition.
How does that make you feel?
Well, it just means I had a lot to catch up on. But that's sort of the way I do things. I see life as a process, and there's a lot to learn, a lot to catch up on. What I have as my Jewish identity I feel good about, and I really don't resent not having more of a religious upbringing.
What's your relationship to the Jewish community now?
Well, actually, since I've been in Seattle, my relationship is much stronger. I'm much more involved with the Jewish community than I was ever before, and that's largely through my work with New Jewish Agenda. I'm involved in the feminist task force, and we're trying to work with the rest of the Jewish community on broadening the vision of Jewish family and problems that have always been around in the Jewish family. So I've been working on anti-homophobia workshops, educating people about issues of lesbians and gay men, working on homophobia as another oppression. And I've been doing some workshops in different synagogues around town.
Excuse me, do you want to explain what homophobia is?
Yeah, homophobia is the active or internal hate or oppression of homosexuals, of lesbians and gay men. It could be held by people who are gay as an internalized oppression, and held by those who don't know much about homosexuality, which is a word I don't like to use very much, but about gayness. It's very clinical. It's what they say about us. It's not the word we use for ourselves.
And do you find a lot of homophobia in the Jewish community?
I found a lot of homophobia in the world, and the Jewish community is not going to be exempt from it.
So what is your relationship, aside from New Jewish Agenda, to the Jewish community? How do you see, for instance, your relationship to halacha, Jewish law?
Well, I'm not very much involved with the Jewish community from that point of view. I was involved with Congregation Tikva Chadashah, the lesbian and gay synagogue, for a couple years when I moved here. But I realized that I was fighting to change it, and what I was trying to change was the synagogue aspect of it. I don't want a synagogue in the sense of studying Torah or the religious aspects of Judaism. What's more important to me is the social connections with other Jews, and just a place to be myself and explore Judaism in other ways, social change, just in broader aspects. And as a lesbian, there isn't much room in much of Jewish thought, in Orthodox Jewish thought. And it's not where I have been wanting to put my efforts in terms of changing things.
What's your concept of Jewishness if it isn't related to Torah and Halacha?
My sense of Jewishness is just who I am. I mean, I am Jewish. I was brought up with certain traditions. I come from Jewish ancestors, a wealth of tradition and history. And just putting that together with the rest of who I am is how I see myself being Jewish. It's very important for me to be involved with Jewish activities, to have Jewish friends, to know what's going on. There's just so much going on now in the Mideast that my Jewish connection is just something I can't ever not be aware of. My Jewishness. Yeah.
Are you related to the humanistic movement, Jewish humanism?
No.
So how do you define yourself as a Jew, a secular Jew?
Well, it's confusing. It changes. If I had to label myself, I would label myself as I'm not sure. A secular Jew. I don't know if that leaves me enough room to be involved in the traditional aspects of it as I'd like to be. But I could just say a traditional Jew.
What was your relationship with Tikva Hadashah?
Well, I went there the first Friday I moved to Seattle. I was very eager to meet other Jewish lesbians and gay men. And actually, through Tikva Hadashah, I had got to know some gay men, which hasn't been something that I have had the experience of having in my life a lot. But I got very involved on the program committee and tried to work on developing rituals to be more of what I wanted. And a lot of people were involved in trying to change some of the ways rituals happened. And it was very hard to do it because the synagogue started with a certain format, and that's the way that some of the people wanted to keep it. And I was involved for about 2 years and dwindled down to the point where I get the newsletter, I'm not a member anymore, and I think fondly of some of the people, and I'm glad it exists, but it doesn't meet the needs of a lot of the lesbians and a lot of the gay men I know in Seattle. But it meets the need of some, but I think it needs to change, and it has some more hope for growth. And my involvement was important to me when I felt like I could make it more of what I needed, but it's not a place that I want to be.
And what is that in terms of your relationship to New Jewish Agenda and Kadima? You seem to have found a home there?
I'm finding more of a home there than I found in other Jewish organizations. I think what's important for me is to have an outward perspective. CTC was a little too...
CTC is?
Congregation Tikva Hadashah. It was a little too small. It ran around in a circle, and we all talked to each other. And I have more of a need to do some more spiritual work by myself and to do my Jewish activism in a group where I can work out. And in New Jewish Agenda and Kadima, it gives me a lot of opportunity to do that. I mean, I'm working both as a lesbian in a Jewish organization and then with the work I do as a Jew in lesbian organizations. And Agenda, being a national organization, puts me in touch with lots of people doing lots of different work. And that's very exciting to me.
And what form specifically does your Jewish activism take?
Well, my Jewish activism isn't always so separate because, as I said, I moved through the lesbian circles as a Jew also with a Jewish presence. And my Jewish activism is most always meshed with my lesbianism. You know? There's not a lot of active lesbians in New Jewish Agenda, especially locally. So it's important for me to have it all together.
So you're still in a minority there?
Very much.
You're always in a minority?
Well, I'm always in the minority in mainstream organizations. That's why it's important for me to be involved in lesbian organizations And some people don't understand that. You know, they say, well, you're lesbian, okay, but why cut out the rest of the world? But that's not at all what I'm doing. It's any oppressed group has to gather strength somewhere. And that's what I do among my lesbian groups, my lesbian friends. And I think my life is more integrated than it ever was in terms of working in mainstream groups, having more of a variety of friends who aren't all lesbians, you know, in my age range, having older friends, younger friends, and having all that be very important.
Do you find anti-Semitism in the mainstream lesbian feminist movement?
Mm-hmm. A lot of it is ignorance, and a lot of it is the idea of that we're dealing with lesbian issues, we're not dealing with Jewish issues. But there's a lot more openness on the part of, well, some people, I think, maybe the people I choose to be with, to understand oppressions. And that's, the lesbian community, there's a lot of work on lots of issues. Right now, I've been working with a group that's planning a Pacific Northwest lesbian feminist conference next fall. And all kinds of issues come up there, and it shows a willingness of lesbians to work on issues that affect us and that are about things that are affecting the world. It's very broad-based.
Mm-hmm. What would you want from the Jewish community? The mainstream Jewish community.
I'd like the Jewish community to be more inclusive. I'd like the Jewish community to not be so threatened by differences in political views on Israel, to differences in lifestyles. You know, the plight of the single mother has always been really hard in the Jewish community. Poverty in the Jewish community is something that people don't talk about. Lesbianism is something that, well, we love you because you're our daughter, but I want to be understood as who I am. And that was a whole struggle in my family. And until I came out and said, this is who I am, and if you want to know about it, I'll tell you, people began to open up and let me in. And that's when I started having a better relationship with my family and bringing my partner with me to family affairs and having people just see me again as Gail and not as the lesbian of the family. Well, actually, if they would have seen me as a lesbian in the family, I would have liked that. I don't think they ever wanted to recognize it that much. So, but as a positive thing. So that's what I'd like of the Jewish community, for myself and for everybody who's struggling to just be individuals. It's like sometimes I think there's a little mold that the mainstream Jewish community has that leaves out a lot of people.
Well, how do you think specific steps could be taken for the Jewish community to be more inclusive? What would you want them to do?
I think some of the synagogue groups are doing some things. Some of the social action committees are working with Kadima, working with other Jewish groups, having discussions, having open discussions on every topic in the world. And I think it's a work that individuals have to do, and then it'll move into the groups that individuals work in.
Do you think it's important to have forums, for instance,
I think forums are very important. I think everything from small discussion groups after services to weekday forums, films. There's a lot of resources out there. You know, the kind of program that you're doing should be used by many groups, including Jewish groups. I think people need to have an attitude that's more inclusive and less frightened. And then it'll be easier to find ways to educate people.
Kadima hasn't had a good relationship with the mainstream Jewish community. They've been kept out of the Community Relations Council. And you've been most active with Kadima, but you're autonomous from Kadima as well. Do you think your relationship with Kadima inhibits your connection with the Jewish community?
Well, I think it gives me one more challenge to work through. Yesterday I happened to be passing by one of the synagogues and I had some Kadima newsletters in my car. So I stopped in knowing that a lot of people would be passing through during the Jewish holidays, and I went in and I was confronted definitely with hostility, and I was very aware of it by one person who said to the rabbi, she wants to know if she could hand these out. And I said, no, that's not at all what I want. I want to know if I can make them available to people who want them. And the rabbi was very accepting, but I just felt this hostility. She saw Kadima, and she had this label for me. And I'm not Kadima. I'm Gail. I work with Kadima. I work with many other groups. And I think it's just one more challenge, as I said. It's really frustrating when people shut you out. And it's ignorance. I just think that it's happened, all the time I've been involved with lesbian activities, that I've been shut out by people who are just too scared to hear it. That's what I really think it's about.
Shut out from what?
Shut out from being heard. I was, a long time ago, I was talking at a progressive alternative high school in New York to high school kids. And most of them were just like amazed that we would come out and talk about being lesbians and gay men. And one young woman was there with a Bible in her hand, and she couldn't hear what we were saying because she had a line that she had to put out. And I don't have a whole lot of patience for people who are not going to hear me, but I also do see it as a challenge to just keep on doing what I'm doing.
Well, what do you say to people who say it's deviant behavior?
I don't feel deviant. I feel very proud of who I am.
Well, how do you educate those people?
Well, they can't educate someone who won't open up. If people want to talk, there's lots to say. There's lots of books to read. There's lots of things that are being directed to specific groups. There's a brochure that's out that's directly, actually there's two brochures that have been written from different gay organizations toward the Jewish population. There's things for people to know, and if people are open, I'll share a lot about myself. There's also forums like the anti-homophobia workshops we've been doing, which are places to learn in a mixed environment. And sometimes these workshops are done just for straight people, and sometimes they're mixed gay and straight groups. And there's lots of room as long as people are open to it.
Do you feel that you have a network of support in a Jewish lesbian feminist movement?
I feel I have a lot of support among a lot of other Jewish lesbian feminists, and also support among other Jews who aren't lesbians. I don't see there being a very separate or specific lesbian feminist Jewish movement, but there are many of us who are involved in the Jewish movement and lesbian feminist work, and many who are not actively involved but are doing their own internal work, which is, I think, is as important. So I do get a lot of support that way, and over the years in different ways.
What would you tell Jewish parents about lesbianism and gayness, how to accept their own children?
Well, if there's been a standard of openness in a family, I think that when someone comes out as a lesbian, that's just going to be one more thing to deal with. It's not going to be any different than any of the other struggles we've gone through. It is specific, and it's not. I don't want to take away from it the importance and the oppressive nature of being a lesbian, but it's also much easier to look at it as just one part of myself. So when my parents were willing to talk about it, even though they didn't understand what I was talking about, I think they wanted a magical answer. Why am I a lesbian? What happened? What went wrong? And it's not.
What do you say to them?
Well, what I've said to them is nothing went wrong. Actually, I think it's very good that I've realized I'm a lesbian because I can go with who I am and be much happier. Over the years, they've met friends of mine. They've been very resistant to go to open meetings and stuff like that. I've given them books. I don't know if they've read them, but they listen and they take in what they can, and I think that parents have to do that. I think if they are there for their children, or that they could be there for their children in the ways they can be, being open to who they are, if they're lesbians. It's just...
But they're not always open.
No,
Some parents sit Shiva for their children.
I know that. Maybe I'm an idealist. I see it as very basic. This is who I am. If you care about me, you'll care to sit down and understand it. If you're going to sit Shiva for me, there's nothing I can do. It's like...
Which means mourn for you as if you were dead.
I know situations like that in my own family. My aunt sat Shiva for her son because he married out of the Jewish faith. You can't talk to people who won't listen. But I would say to people, listen, you know, there's nothing to be gained by shutting out what you don't know. You can only gain from opening up.
Is there a Jewish women's movement that you feel that you're a part of?
I think there's a lot of things happening that could be put into a Jewish women's movement. And a lot of that is, I've become aware of a lot of that through New Jewish Agenda stuff, but I know it's happening outside of that also. I think there's a lot of things happening that aren't very well organized.
Such as?
Such as people getting together on Shabbat right here in Seattle, talking about all the things that affect us as Jewish women, and lots of literature that's been written over the years, books, anthologies on Jewish women's thought. I know there's work going on in the mainstream synagogues. I think there's a lot happening, and I think I'm very much part of it.
Rosh Hashanah is coming up. What will you be doing for Rosh Hashanah?
Well, on the tangible level, I'll be going to services that Kadima has. I'll be having a lesbian feminist potluck dinner with other Jewish lesbians on Tuesday. I'll be taking some time to think and reflect on my own. And I'll probably be calling my parents in New York.
Well, I wish you a very good Yom Tov, and thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Good night.